Hey everyone, happy Friday. I have a new type of video for you all. I've been getting lots of questions about something very specific, and that is books. We know what books are. And so I've been getting lots of questions from students on what book they should read or what books I recommend. And so I decided to start going through a couple of them. There's going to be like 5 people that watch this, but it's okay. But I'm going to go through a couple of them. And the first one, and there's going to be the sticky notes and stuff coming out of it, but is David Platt's Radical. And we're going to be going through this today. And I'm going to give you just a couple of the main points. It's not going to explain everything, but that's okay. Also, just as a note, my kids and everyone are awake right now as I film this. So you might hear background noise. I'll probably note it in the video after the fact. But so, David Platt's Radical. This is a smaller book, and at least in my terms, it's about 220 pages or so. And he goes over a huge amount of topics and questions because he is feeling pretty convicted with stuff. But he starts out answering this question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? So what does it look like to follow Jesus? And I'm going to give you a quote from him. He asks the question, is Jesus worth it? Is he worth it? And so he writes, do we really believe he is worth abandoning everything for? Jesus. Do we believe that he's worth abandoning everything for? Do you and I really believe that Jesus is so good, so satisfying, and so rewarding that we will leave all that we have and all that we own and all that we are in order to find our fullness in him? Do you and I believe him enough to obey him and to follow him wherever he leads, even when the crowds in our culture and maybe in our own churches turn the other way? Do we believe that Jesus is who he says he is? And if so, have we responded in a way that we say that we actually believe it? Because we can say lots of things, but until we do actions, he goes on, it doesn't really amount to anything. And so this first question, it kind of sets the tone for the whole book. It's like, do you believe in Jesus the way that you're supposed to? And he goes on. There's 7 things I'm going to talk about, 7 different questions or 7 different things. But he goes on and he talks about what it actually means to follow Jesus. And if you look at the disciples and what they did after Jesus ascended and what they did while Jesus was here, it was a radical type of lifestyle change. People left their professions. They went to go follow this guy who was the Messiah. And so he answers it really well because this book is a lot about interpersonal or inside reflection. And then he goes on and he asks this question, are we dependent on ourselves and our own strengths and our own powers and our own efforts and our own resources, or are we dependent on him? Do we look for his guidance, or do we look at our own experience? Do we worry about things that we have no control over, or do we look for him? Are we looking for his spirit like it's actual treasure? And that's a great question, because that question has been stuck in my mind and it's been coming up. Like in this moment, am I actually looking for Christ? Or am I just losing time? Am I actually doing this? And so David Platt puts down this scenario of saying we need to look for the Spirit and we need to look for Jesus and the things that we can do for him like it's treasure. And that was like a punch. Because sometimes I don't do that. Sometimes I just want to do nothing with that. It's a good question. So are you looking for a spirit like treasure? The third thing that he kind of talks about is how we in America, and specifically he's talking to the American church, like not really more so overseas church, but the American church. He seems to have kind of a problem with it, which if you read it, it's pretty apparent what it is. But he went to a church to talk about serving overseas, and the pastor got up and he writes and talks about how he's so happy and so thankful that he's here in America and that he doesn't need to leave here. And so he says that some aren't called to go spread the gospel. It's not just for some people. It's not just for those super Christians. It's not just for missionaries. It's not just for those people who are like these ridiculous like evangelists and stuff. He's said some aren't called to the gospel and to spreading it and to making disciples who make disciples who make disciples, but all Christians are called to spread Christ's name. And we are called to make disciples of everyone. And then he asks the question, will you do that? Will you do that? And he points out that disciples are self-replicating. They're kind of like a virus. They make more of themselves. And so he talks about, actually, I'll just read it for you. He says this story. Imagine being in Sudan. You walked into a thatched hut with a small group of Sudanese church leaders, and you sit down to teach them God's word. As soon as you start, you lose eye contact with all of them. No one is looking at you, and you hardly see their eyes the rest of the time. And the reason is because they're writing down every word that you say. They come up to you afterward and say, "Teacher, we are going to take everything we have learned from God's word, translate it into our languages, and teach it in our tribes." And then the key phrase here, they were not listening to receive, but to reproduce. And we, a lot of times, I feel we can listen to receive just for us, and then it just stays in us, and then where it goes, I don't know, and it doesn't go outside. But he's saying that we need to listen to reproduce. Disciples listen to reproduce. We want to reproduce the teachings to other people so that they can know what we've learned, and they can know about Jesus. And it's kind of a cool thing. And there's a I can't find the video. I've been looking everywhere for it, but it's a video about a woodworker. And he says, "I'm a woodworker. I grew up in a family of woodworkers." And he talks about how much he loves woodworking and what it means to him. And then the person holding the camera says, "What is your favorite thing that you've made?" And he's like, "Oh, I've never made anything." And it just doesn't sit well. And so he's asking that same thing. Like, we might have received stuff our entire lives of just knowledge and all these things, which are good things, but have we reproduced that in other people? And so that's the question he asks. And then the fourth thing that he goes on and says, this one was a big one, I think, for lots of Americans in particular, because he talks about our wealth. And some people really don't like me talking about that, but those are the people that this is directed to. He talks about our wealth. He says to sacrifice your wealth, not give, sacrifice. Give in a way that's like the widow with the 2 coins. She sacrificed her wealth. Didn't give her wealth, she sacrificed. It physically hurt her to give that, and she trusted Christ in it. And so he has a series of emails from some of his members. And I thought it'd be apropos to say some of these. So he says, I received the following email from one of our members. My wife and I went home, emptied all of our clothes onto the bed, got several bags of canned goods, and all the baby clothes our son had grown out of, in addition to the toys he doesn't play with anymore. I took several $100 cash that I was saving up to upgrade the front lawn and drove out over to the projects downtown and prayed. I prayed for the people I didn't know who were about to receive what I had too much of. In the first house was a man of 30 who had a baby and needed some work clothes. Perfect. I had my clothes to give him and baby toys and clothes. He needed money for groceries, so I gave him $100. The next house had 3 boys, all under the age of 12, so I gave them our TV, VCR, and 2 video game consoles. Their mother needed some groceries, so I gave her $100. The next house had a couple who needed some clothing for the wife and money for a car payment, so I gave her my wife's clothes and $100. We prayed with each family, told them we came with God. I got such a rush from this when we got home and got more things together to give away. My wife and I are now consistently serving at the homeless center downtown, and I'm going to start teaching art and graphics at the Homing Learning Center. And he gets another email, David Platt. So David Platt's a pastor, I forget where, but he had a huge church for a bit. So this woman named Lisa, and he says in his faith family, says, "For months I've been listening to the word and banging my head against the wall, trying to reconcile my life with what the gospel demands. I've been trying to find some comfortable alternative between my life now and the radical idea of selling everything I own and leaving the comfortable life to take the gospel to the world. But I realized there's no comfortable alternative. Risking it all is the only option. So I'm selling my stuff on the internet and trying to pay off my debt so I can give as much as possible. In order to pay off my debt, I am really having to sell almost everything I have except the shirt on my back and maybe a spare. I can't wait to see what happens from here. I'm totally unprepared, totally inadequate, totally scared, but I'm ready. Bring it on." That's sacrificing. That's sacrificing wealth. And he talks about how we're called to sacrifice, not just give, but sacrifice our wealth so that we can trust the Lord more. And he talks about how urgent this is, how urgent the gospel is. And he talks about how many people are on the earth. And he says there's billions of people who don't know Christ. Billions. And that's a crazy thing to think about because we know that without Christ, you are eternally separated from him. And people are dying every day. We need to get this gospel out there, whether it's here or the world beyond. And he says this is the simple divine plan for taking the gospel to all the peoples of the world. He says God sends his servants preach, and then people hear, and hearers believe, and then believers call, and everyone who is called is saved. They become servants, and then God sends his servants. His servants preach, people call, hearers believe, believers call, everyone who calls is saved. And it keeps going and going and going and going. And that was the way that God saved the earth, is what David Platt says. The last one, and this last part, the last two actually, hit a little closer to home because it asks you basically, are you willing to serve the way that you're supposed to? Are you willing to serve? Are you willing to serve in a way where if God called you to somewhere dangerous that you would go? And that's a good question for people. That's a great question. Are you willing to deny yourself to whatever happens? Are you willing to push yourself and put yourself in a situation where you must depend on Christ? Someone whose name C.T. Studd, he was 1860 to 1931. He wrote this, what I'm about to say. He was a Christian worker, and he, at age 50, decided retirement was not an option, and he spent the remaining years of his life in Sudan. And his grave became the stepping stone for the worldwide evangelization crusade, which helped spell gospel seeds all over Africa, Asia, and South America. Listen to the reward he was living for. So Studd was living for a reward, as expressed in some of the last words he wrote before he died. And he said, "Too long have we been waiting for one another to begin. The time for waiting is past. Should such men as we fear, before the whole world, before the sleepy, lukewarm, faithless, namby-pamby Christian world, we will dare to trust our God, and we will do it with his joy unspeakable singing aloud in our hearts. We will 1,000 times sooner die trusting only in our God than live trusting in man. And when we come to this position, the battle's already won and the end of the glorious campaign in sight. We will have the real holiness of God, not the sickly stuff of talk and dainty words and pretty thoughts. We will have a masculine holiness, one of daring faith and works for Jesus Christ. He said that he was tired of living a lukewarm life. He's tired of it, and he needed to go do things for Christ. Are you willing to lay down the things that you have to go do that? And then David ends with a challenge. He ends with a challenge. And so this is the challenge. The challenge is for 1 year, and it involves 5 components. He says, I dare you over the next year to pray for the entire world, to read through the entire word, to sacrifice your money for a specific purpose, to spend your time in another context, which is like a different culture, and then commit your life to a multiplying community. Go out and make disciples. That's what he's saying. And he ends with that challenge. But I want to come up with the reason why the book is written. So it's called Radical, right? And so basically he asks these questions in this book, and you have to answer them. You can't read this and not answer them. This is a great book. I highly recommend it. But he says, do I search? And he's making you ask these questions. Do I search for Christ? Do I actually search for him like he's treasure? Do I long to be in his presence? Do I long for him? Do I see his law and the things that he says as a hindrance to my life or a blessing to it? Is it life-giving? And do I actually trust him to do what he says he'll do? And there's this one too. What if? What if the stories of longing for him, following him no matter what, spreading his name, wasn't the exception of the Christian faith, wasn't for the select few, wasn't for the people who went out and dedicated their lives, those crazy people, but what if it wasn't for the exception, but that was actually the norm? That's why he calls this book Radical, because he's calling us to be radical, because that's what we should be. What if that was the goal, to live life in a way where we search for Christ, we long for him, we see his law as life-giving, and we trust him, and then we go act in that way? And how would your faith change? How would your faith change? If you lived in that way, how would your life change and how would your faith change? And would you actually respond to it? Or would you just have the same old and be content with what you have? So I highly, highly, highly recommend, if you have the ability to read this, read it. Radical. I'm going to try to do these every couple weeks, even after this isolation thing is over, because resources are good. If you've not been in this book, though, this book right here, that's the book you need to get into. That one is way more important. So my question for you is, the 5 people who have watched this whole thing, if you read this book, will you respond to the challenges that is given? And if you read this book, will you spend time and serve the one that this is about? Thank you for watching this video. I don't know what the next one will be. I don't know when the next one will be, because I have to read these before I promote them to you. Let us know what you think at #Lakeland Youth Group. And I hope you all have a great Friday. See you next time.